We are live now, Akshat. So just
Oh,
give me, yeah, we are live.
go. Looks like we are live. I think we can start with the session then.
Yes.
Thanks everyone for joining us on this session. We are, yes, we are joined by Mr. Ujjwal Sharma, Raizo Kukin, that is his alias that he goes by on the internet. He is a compilers hacker at Igalia. He's a TC39 co-chairperson, Node.js core collaborator, international speaker. There's a plethora of things he has done, and he also uh, is very much a volunteer in the open source community, and he does all these things to give back to the community. So we are very happy to have him here today, and I think we have some questions. Like we do have some questions for him. Before we go with that, I shall ask Vishal to give a brief introduction about himself and FOSS United and this event.
Uh, sure. Thanks, Akshat. Uh, uh, Sorry. We are still fixing a few issue with the audio video. So thanks, Akshat. So I'd like to take a few minutes to speak about FOSS United and FOSS Clubs. So hi, I am Vishal. I work for FOSS United. Uh, I have been working here for more than 3.5 years. I My job involves in around all things at FOSS United. Uh, Personally, I recently I started writing about how FOSS can create jobs, and I started writing about FOSS from the economic perspective. So I know you can find on vishaya.com. But talking about FOSS United, we it has been almost 4 years since FOSS United started, and we are almost 10,000 community all over India. And the reason FOSS United has started is to promote the use and creation of free and open source software in India. I mean, we Indians have a higher rate of consumption than production of FOSS in India, so we felt the need of it. So currently, we have more than seven active city chapters, and more than 13 cities where we have done few FOSS activities. Uh, so if you are a part of cities like Bangalore, Kochi, Chennai, Hyderabad, Pune, Mumbai, uh, do join our events. We are active on Telegram forum, you know, and we you can catch us during events and FOSS Club events like this. Yearly events like India FOSS, FOSS Hack are our major events where we try to have a dialogue at bigger level. Okay, talking about FOSS Club, the agenda is to create culture, FOSS culture within college campus. For example, we have Ujjwal and Akshay from JIT Noida, and one of the reason I believe a lot of people I see from JIT Noida going out, you know, uh, landing with a greater career, good job opportunities because of the culture, FOSS culture within the campus. The club OSDC has brought a lot of helped a lot of students in the career, and that's what the idea is. One of our goal is to see that kind of community in almost all the colleges in India. And currently we have 12 clubs around 10 other cities, different cities. Events like workshop, expert talks, Linux installation party, mini FOSS hackathons are our initial plans to see happening in these cities, in these clubs. So we support through mentorship. We financial support, or our aim is to send. expert speakers and give educational resources to the club members. So the first member, we have only 12 leads, 12 campuses, and we think by the next batch, which is the application will be live by July. We aim that will support around 50 campuses in India directly through the FOSS Club. That's it. I think I have taken a lot of time already. So I would like Akshat and Ujjwal to take this conversation forward. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining.
Thanks, Vishal. Really appreciate that intro. It is true. Ujjwal and I have shared the same college. He's my alma mater. I
I think Akshat's voice account. Yeah. Okay, he's here.
that I may have been losing the connection. So yeah, Ujjwal is an alma mater. He had a talk at our college earlier, and I am somewhat familiar with his journey, which is why I might be able to comment on it and asking questions. But let's start with the first most obvious one, I guess. I think a lot of us would be curious. What do you do at Igalia, and how does the work there look like?
Yeah, that's a question people love to hear about. The other day, I had a few friends over. They saw my story about this uh, interview, and we're joking about how the poster said compiler's hacker. Well, that's what my title is, but it can be quite entertaining for people to figure out what that actually means. Thankfully, this is not going to be a community that has that issue. I imagine hacker culture is something that is deep into the veins of the FOSS community. Uh, Definitely back at OSDC, and I assume also in the rest of the clubs all around. But yeah, so what does it mean to be a compiler's hacker, right? We primarily have a Igalia, if you don't know about us, is one of the organizations that uh, creates a lot of impact in open source software. We do this through consulting. So we are consultants who work on various open source projects. It can be like Chromium, it can be WebKit or the kernel, or graphic stack stuff like Mesa, like um, GStreamer, and so on. So a lot of these low-level software projects require a lot of work to be done. Sometimes there's many organizations that utilize this software, right? Like the open source software, as we know, make the backbone of all of the software infrastructure that we use. So maybe there is, say, an automobile company that needs GStreamer to support a certain thing for their media solution for the car. How do they do this? Either they develop something proprietary and in-house and sort of work that through in that direction. Unfortunately, a lot of the times, bigger organizations lack the existing expertise to do any of these, or they just cannot afford to actually dedicate their own employees to do this. So Igalia steps in those cases. Essentially, organizations hire us to do various tasks around the open source ecosystem. It can mean maintenance, for example. Maybe you need Chromium or WebKit to support a certain class of hardware that you use it on. For example, you might have known that the PlayStation software is WebKit based. So, it's a non-Apple device that runs everything through WebKit. Uh, can it always run everything? Well, the PlayStation engineers make sure that's why it's so important for it to be open source. But sorry, I deviated too far. What the compilers team, the one that I am a part of, does is it focuses on the development of compilers and more abstractly the development of programming languages. So that means working on programming language standards, that is the JavaScript standard or the WebAssembly standard or any other standards moving forwards, and then add support for the various features that are landed in these standards or that we land ourselves in these standards through implementation in various browsers and non-browser engines, in runtimes, sometimes like Node, and so on. These days, my personal role is mostly about the standards. I focus on programming language development and design, like JavaScript is, as you might have noticed, is the fastest growing and one of the most generally capable programming languages out there. So it's a challenge to develop new features. It's a challenge to consolidate everything and make sure that the future of JavaScript is something consistent and nice to use. So that's kind of uh, the intersection of where I work on.
Cool. I think it's quite fascinating for a lot of people to know what careers in open source could actually look like. To be frank, that's quite what you described sounds pretty inspiring and very badass. And so I think we should, the next question should naturally take us to the very beginning. And I wanted to ask you, how did you like end up here? So to answer that, how did you get started with programming? Can you tell us about that?
Well, I would admit that at first I didn't want to do programming. I got stuck with programming because at some point I must have realized that I was decently good at it, or I felt that I was decently good at it. Again, like I was younger, and my um, both my understanding of what's good and bad was skewed, as well as just the amount of things that I could actually do. So obviously, like there wasn't a whole lot else for me to do, right? But I started when I was really young with playing a lot of video games and thinking all of these video games suck. Like I could do a much better job in trying than essentially to make some. In realizing how difficult they were, and how big of an emphasis there is on art, on sound, on media in general, especially in modern games, right? Already at the time, video games were quite complicated. So one aspect of video game development that really stuck to me was programming, because it was something that I could really do as a kid who was just starting to experience things, but also really, it is one of the more powerful things to do, because you can obviously, like, it's really weird of me to say, if I had to say that making video game art is less creative in some ways than video game programming. But is that really a crazy idea? I mean, if you think about it, especially in terms of software like video games, where there's a lot of scope of like how things can happen, I feel that there's a lot of leeway in terms of like how you could program things, or like how you approach certain game elements, right? So yeah, I definitely felt quite creative while writing code for video games. I even tried to sort of be part of bigger teams. It was before I knew about open source, but still, I tried to do something. And yeah, I started to learn how to program. I uh, learned like C++ and C sharp, which is what most people would write video games in. But it wasn't a great sort of thing for me to do long term, because I had no idea what I was doing. So I switched to web development, because that was something that I felt at the time that anybody with a computer could just do by themselves, right? Like there's three things to do. There's the content, there's the layout, and the styling, and the interactions, but and technically only one of them is programming. But still, it felt like somebody with just a text editor could actually create something full and artistic in itself. So yeah, after that I sort of probed around a bit, used to program in sort of with different tools in different languages. I remember getting really uh, into like Ruby and and all the ecosystem there. And I kind of miss that era of web development, right? But yeah, that's how I started, and eventually moved on to different projects with different priorities than websites.
And like when you started, this was like I don't suppose you kind of depended on any curriculum or any structured way of learning it. I suppose it all came naturally to you from by yourself.
I thought so because I've always been, oh well, okay, maybe I figured out through this process, right? Because at the time I was learning these complicated things maybe for the first time in my life, and hadn't realized that I would have to keep doing this with different technologies over and over again. I realized that learning through like project, learning through sort of trying to build something is a very interesting experience in itself. Obviously, you can get by without a curriculum, but you cannot get by without a plan. And that is something that I feel is always a big concern. Like, um, whenever people make big projects, whenever people make big teams, uh, they do that with some intent, right? But they might or might not have a clear plan. So the best part about, like, trying to learn something out of, hey, I want to build this thing, is at least you have a plan, which not everybody does. So that's like really helpful in pushing you towards the goal. Also, it helps you clear out anything that's unnecessary, right? Like, we also have this big tendency to focus on something that doesn't really matter. I've listened to so many people, especially in university, now that I realize like our audience is mostly students. So many people will come to you and give you excuses for why they're not started yet. They have the ideas, they have the skills, or maybe they don't have the skills, but they will come up with something. I need to learn a little bit more. I need to practice a little bit more. I need more time, or whatever. But I don't think it matters. I think how do you know that you need to learn something without actually trying to do it, right? So I do feel that even without a curriculum, I progressed very quickly, maybe even more quick than I did, like, when learning things through a curriculum in university, because I was focused more on achieving a goal that I had rather than learning for the sake of it, which is like not particularly helpful.
Cool. That is something I think that also I can resonate with. I wanted to ask, since how you mentioned, like people that get started with learning, you can start with building personal projects and learning that way, but contributing to open source is kind of a bit of a jump. So, how did that happen to you? Like, how did you find out about open source, and how did you get started with it?
Well, throughout my sort of yeah, games development is a weird area in itself, in that it's not very open source, and like, a lot of the tools, a lot of the ideas and the projects are quite proprietary. That's sort of the dynamics of that industry. But coming to web development, I already saw that like almost everything that I used at the time was open source. Um, Add to the fact that I'm already operating on top of this sort of open source base, right? Like, I have a Linux based operating system, I have Firefox. So all of these things are sort of streaming open source to me. But I think the big thing came to me, like the big sort of a push came from this service called Free Code Camp. So there was a point at which I realized, like, okay, I need to go back and sort of, like, in the middle of a project, realizing, okay, I need to clear some basics, because this JavaScript thing is really like, not something that I have a very tight grasp on. And I realized Free Code Camp is an amazing service that teaches people programming, web programming at least, for free. Um, It's completely open source. It's completely designed, including the curriculum, by volunteers. And that was one of the first projects in which, like, I genuinely felt a strong connection. I felt that I was, the project was doing a very important service for me. It was teaching me how to program, but the fact that the what they were teaching me to code was essentially the same set of technologies that Free Code Camp was built eh, with itself, it was a very interesting synergy, right? So you're learning, and with every lesson that you're learning, you're being more capable of contributing back to the project. So that was something that really propelled me to try and do this, right? And I did, and that sort of gave me this impetus, this motivation to do that more often. Um but the biggest sort of shift in my approach happened when I joined university and met everybody in OSDC. So finally, I wouldn't feel so. How do I put it? Like, so nervous or so daunted by an open source project, because OSDC had its own open source project. So I started like working on these open source projects and really like cutting my teeth, or like gaining my confidence on smaller projects that like maybe a group of 5 people are working on, and like I could talk to these people. So it really allowed me to like learn the motions, the process, and how everything works in a safe space. So I think that's one of the more important things that any club can do. For example, like create an environment where people can experience open source software development without actually having to be in an uncomfortable space. Not that it's really uncomfortable. I have no idea why I was so shy of working on a real project. But anywho, it helped me of that shyness. So yeah, with that shyness, I guess. So what ended up happening is that by the end of like 6 7 months, 8 months, I was already like in the mindset of somebody who is like not a passive open source user, but a contributor, right? So every time I would use something, I would think about how it could be improved and so on, and that really shifted the mindset, and really allowed me to think about open source project in terms of projects and not just binaries and uh, products.
Yes, I suppose this was also how you stumbled upon what free software is and the whole philosophy behind FOSS projects, right?
Well, yes, after, or like sort of around the time I was starting to dig into open source software and get more acquainted with it, get more excited about it, I was exposed to sort of the free software movement and its different trappings. I would say that if overall, if you think about it, I have been uh, on average ambivalent about it, because there was early on a period of my life where I was very, very excited about the free software movement, about the FSF, about GNU and everything, and I was like, yes, this is the most important thing in the world. These days I've shifted drastically from that position. So yeah, free software has sort of been around and has been uh, really important for the development of like our open source software commons that we have now. The GPL as a license is very essential to all of these things to happen. But I do feel that, like, overall, the free software movement these days is not, uh, something that is focused, or like something that has a lot of merit.
Cool. I suppose like I can relate as in my introduction to FOSS, and like you said, contributing to open source projects had been through OSDC, and I think for a lot of students in college, which I think would be the majority of audience of this talk, something having a culture like that in our college can be huge, and just having that sort of welcoming space. So, which is also why I'm a really big fan of the FOSS Clubs initiative that we have been doing here at FOSS United. Uh, I so continuing your journey about like contributing to OSTCs, open source projects. What happened there? I see you had the Google Summer of Code experience, which like was it a big step for your open source journey, or did you do some contributions before or after?
Well, yeah, thank you for the question. It's amazing. Yeah, there was a whole like series of ebbs and flows, right? Like it was not quite as linear as I would have preferred. What happened was that when I arrived in university, when I arrived in OSDC and started talking to people, that's the first time that I actually got to know about Google Summer of Code, the program, and like, how everything works. I was really excited about it and sort of thought at the back of my head if I could actually be a part of it. Um, and yeah, like the journey to it was quite interesting. Like I started quite early on. All things considered, I started before sort of Hacktoberfest the previous year to look for organizations. So around the time that Hacktoberfest was running, and that was, by the way, my first one, I was already like contributing to this organization that I had like thought about eventually applying for in Google Summer of Code. So I had a plan, and the plan worked more or less in straightforwardly, if that's a word. But yeah, basically the idea was that before the program rolled around, I already managed to have a decent working relationship with the community that was there. Sort of start working on their projects, not sort of be unknown to the mentors, or just not have a clue about the community or their code bases. For the actual program itself, I suggested different sort of proposal. So that was quite interesting, but it went through. So, well, sorry, I mean, it happened. They accepted me. And so that was a whole phase of like me working hard and sort of, delivering as much as I could. In the end, it happened successful, like it finished successfully.
Live again.
I
Uh,
hope so. So,
so
yeah, sorry. Go on.
yeah, uh, I'll just do a quick read of an introduction to Google Summer of Code and other related open source programs. What they do is they incentivize contributing to open source organizations by providing uh, a setting where you get personally mentored by the maintainers, and they also sometimes offer a stipend, so that helps people get into open source. So yes, Ujjwal, you were
Yeah,
saying.
so yeah, I was just reiterating that Google Summer of Code was very different at the time. But what I realized out of all of it, out of my experience, was that my first interpretation of the whole thing was very bad, and I was an idiot. First of all, I shouldn't have trusted others, but also I should have been smarter myself. But what I realized was that this was not the end game. This was far from it. And open. To be fair, Google Summer of Code says this, but we just don't trust it. But yeah, the answer was exactly as Google had mentioned, which was that Google Summer of Code is really, really at the bottom of it, a beginner program. Uh, it might be difficult to get through it at times. It can happen because of like the competition. But remember, that doesn't change anything. Just because there's more competition doesn't mean that it's something more than it actually is, which is a very like simple program that only really requires a very like simple set of skills in terms of open source contribution, and that really only exists to incentivize people working on source software uh, out of work, out of school, and get them a head start. But it is a head start. It's not the end game in any way. And so, once I realized that, it really opened everything up for me, because now I realized that, holy shit, like, what am I doing here? I only barely started contributing to a real open source project. So, like, the goal in life, or like, at the time, in short term goal in my career, is not to get through the program, sort of have something nice to talk about, to tell people about, to have on your resume, and then, like, pick up the most random job that I can with that, and go on with that. But instead, to be more serious over time about open source projects. They're giving me an opportunity to work on open source projects more seriously, and I should treat it as that. So I started becoming more serious about open source software. Started working on different projects, right? Like, with varying degrees of complexity, starting with Node, and then Electron and V8 and so on. So yeah, that sort of really gave me the kick I needed to charge into this area of, like, low level software, and actually being useful to the extent where somebody would hire me to work on it.
Cool. I think like with your journey, after like at one point you felt like you need to do some real stuff, or when you got serious about it. I think that is an awesome example of what we see a lot in the FOSS community, which is the hacker mindset, or like that culture of tinkering with technology. I remember you say speaking about how you started going one level deep in everything that you were working on, working with. Uh, can you talk about this mindset and how it is actually helpful?
Definitely. So this is again not something that I can take any amount of credit for, but
Yep.
one of my seniors in university, and a great mentor and a guide, who to this day helps us all the time from OSDC, actually, um, was one of the sort of forces of nature that pushed me towards this. He literally shook me by the shoulders and was like, "Dude, what are you doing?" And he had a point, because I didn't actually have an understanding of software development uh, to begin with. I was just a person who uh, had learned like one programming language, or uh, maybe even that would be a stretch at that point. Like, I knew how to make a very specific kind of programs, and I was quite confident of that. But it doesn't change the fact that I really don't have a grasp on what else I'm doing. So one thing that they suggested me uh, to try was to sort of learn and get used to everything around me, and then whenever I start getting too comfortable, to go a level deeper. And that really shifted my view on things, because until then, I feel that I couldn't really appreciate abstractions for what they are. Also, just understand abstractions better. You don't need to appreciate them in order to just accept that there are all these different levels of abstraction. So at first, I started looking deeper into JavaScript projects, and sort of frameworks that sort of helped me build my code, whatever I was doing at the time, and so on. Eventually, ended up with Node. And once you think about this, you realize, like, the journey becomes obvious. Like, from going from basically making simple JavaScript projects to writing npm modules to starting to sort of uh, get around to Node, working on Node on the core, first working on the bindings that sort of Node exposes, eventually working on the core on the sort of VM side, so the part that runs and invokes V8, and then eventually moving on to V8, and then uh, starting to be sort of tinkering with the language itself. So that sort of gives you a clear progression from higher level to lower level. Uh, I don't know how low this level is. It feels very abstract, but I also love like thinking abstractly in terms of programming language evolution. I think it's important that somebody does this and somebody makes sure that like the language grows in a healthy way, but doesn't like become a monster like a Frankenstein's monster or something that is just like too big and too ugly and too sort of complicated to wrap your head around, which is something that you know we know has happened to certain programming languages in the past, and seems to be happening to them in the present. So yeah, that's the set of challenges that motivate me at this stage of abstraction.
Cool. I was curious. Do you still find time to contribute to, projects outside of work with everything else going on?
Well, that's a very hurtful question. I would like
Uh,
to. I would like to do more, obviously. But I think that these days, anything that I do outside of work is, in terms of open source, is basically negligible. This is, I wouldn't necessarily call this unfortunate, though, to be honest. I think that I was working with a very different mode back when I was in university. I was working very hard um, inside and outside of the classroom and sort of trying to juggle so many things together because I had like no job and sort of no idea of what I was going to do. Now that I do work full time in open source software, I don't feel the need to exceptionally like go out and work on certain projects outside of my work schedule, or also thanks to sort of how we work around things in Igalia and sort of figure out what to work on. I don't really have a need to do this. Like if there's something that I'm um, excited enough about to work on, I believe that I could just figure out a way to do this as part of my work.
cool. Yeah, I totally get it as well. I think, yeah, it's all about finding that balance, and as well, what you do is actually kind of badass in itself. So, I wanted to ask this question because I remember once you got started contributing to open source, uh, I think conferences played a big role in networking and getting to know the people in the field. So can you share like how that was like the next step?
Yes, absolutely. Like when I started out in these bigger projects, I was a very different person in terms of like going out and speaking in these different events. Also, like something like this wouldn't really like I'm not saying that I would be opposed to an interview like this, but I would definitely not like
Mm.
enthusiastically be a part of it. Not that I wasn't, organizing or sort of being in a volunteer position in different groups. I just didn't realize how important this communication aspect of programming is. So I was very focused on the actual programming itself. To the extent when of where like when the Node collaborators, the most amazing people who work super hard to make Node what it is, invited me to hang out at the collaborator summit and sort of um, participate and see what it's like. I was skeptical at first. I didn't quite find the idea so exciting. I guess I should have in hindsight, but I didn't for some reason. I did realize that it was like sort of a shot in the dark, and I wasn't quite sure what I was gain out of this, right? So it was co-located with a conference. I guess I could say that it was at the time, it isn't organized anymore, but it's one of the best conferences that I've been to of all time. It was JSConf Europe. Uh, and I didn't even bother considering getting a ticket or speaking, obviously. Like, I had no experience with that whatsoever either. But once I was there and I talked to people and I just existed around, I realized how important they were. I realized how important it was for me to know and talk to these people in person. It really strengthened my working relationships with them in general. Like, this is something that I've learned throughout my professional life in general. Like that, right now I work in a very uh, distributed team. Like, people in my team work across the world, but I still put a lot of emphasis on us meeting each other for meetups or like offsite events, and discussing things not online but in person, because I realize how important it is to sort of have this kind of rapport, have this kind of relationship with people where how to talk to them, essentially, right? Also, I realized, like, the amount of great work that comes out of these events. I remember, like, JSConf Europe was exceptionally good at this, and at the time I could feel that the who's who of JavaScript was there, including at the time all of the V8 folks. So they, for instance, talking to them eventually culminated in me not only learning all I knew at the time about compilers and compilers development in V8, but also just being in contact with these people and being at speaking terms with these people, not being sort of shy to ask them something technical. Uh, and this eventually culminated in sort of me being comfortable around people and around projects. But yeah, I would have certainly missed out on a lot if I hadn't traveled and sort of started meeting people. So yes, if from what I can, with whatever authority I have in convincing you of something, I would try to convince you to sort of attend events and programming events and well, events like these, because it really opens up your horizons in ways that you cannot actually predict. You meet a bunch of people, you come up with new ideas. It's absolutely a joy.
Yep, I also agree. Like the past year, I have, uh, among other events, I have been attending the FOSS United events, and I kind of really dig what they do. They have like the city chapters thing, having events there. There's FOSS Clubs thing, and then there's also India FOSS. They, if I remember correctly, they did a diversity scholarship thing, which enabled a lot of students and attend that event, which was very cool. So I think the next question that I have for you would be just bringing it back to the students' relatability level. Uh, I think when contributing to open source, a lot of where the real challenge lies is when you have a big code base in front of you, and that can seem pretty intimidating to people starting out. So how do you approach like big code bases? And I think that's something that people should know.
Yeah, I would like to sort of repurpose a generally applicable thing for this. But like, in the context of learning new skills or learning new things in general, I've heard people mention a couple of times this idea of learning how to be a novice, right? And I really love this idea because I think this applies more generally than people actually think it does, and it definitely holds very true for programming projects. And I would say, from my limited experience working on non-open source software, which thankfully is limited, it also applies to non-open source projects, which is that the most important skill, or like if that would count as a skill at all, would be to learn how to be a beginner, how to be a novice. Because as programmers who eventually over time and work and sort of a lot of hand holding understand how a project works, it is very frightening to just jump into a new project where you know nothing. Unfortunately, or fortunately, in a freeing way, that is the natural state of things. No matter how skilled you think you are, or like you are, I guess the at the end of the day, every new software project is a new software project. Depending on the programming language, I guess Python might be like a massive exception, but um, apart from certain specific um, things or areas or sort of programming languages, I feel that almost every project develops its own language, its own sort of systems, its own sort of DSL thingy, which ends up informing how people write code. Definitely rings true for C and C++ projects, where you can have like a buttload of macros and everything's sort of wrapped around in macros. But also JavaScript can have its own sort of system. It could invent its own type system, for example. Every JavaScript project these days does that. So I think at the end of the day, learning how to get into a project and being comfortable, especially, like, obviously you'll have to learn, but being comfortable with being an absolute beginner by starting with reading things around, reading documentation, writing documentation, searching for issues that are very simple, that might include also writing documentation, moving on to something like testing, working through the test, reading through the test. All of these things are absolutely necessary to do in any open source project to get used to it. Now, obviously, if you're a subject matter expert in that area and have some experience maybe working on very similar projects, then you could, like, skip through some of these parts. But I think overall, you always need a start with a project, and there's no other way to do that than by starting with zero, and not thinking too much of yourself. Just uh, nobody's too good to work on tests. Tests are some of the most important things. So yes, write tests, write documentation, actually get to know the project like you got to know your first project. And yeah, there's no cheats.
That is awesome advice. Thank you very much. I think we should be quick with our questions and answers now because it's almost time. I so one of the questions that I was really looking forward to and wanted to ask you was, I think people should remember that there are alternatives to the Google Summer of Code and programs. There are more open source programs. One of them, namely, being Igalia's coding experience program. Can you speak about that? Like, what it does, how it could be helpful to the audience?
Absolutely. The Igalia coding experience program is very close to my heart. I don't know if you know about this or mentioned this, but I also went through the program. I didn't finish it, but eventually ended up joining Igalia. The coding experience program is simple, but it doesn't. The name itself doesn't say much, so I can explain what it is. The coding experience program exists because Igalia works on very specific things and very specific projects, and it's very difficult for us to hire people. In most of the areas where we work, whenever we need help, and it happens a lot more often these days than it did previously. And we, because we work also ourselves in the area that we're expanding to, and like we are not expanding into completely new areas, not randomly anyway. We know if there's some matter experts that we could hire, or like if somebody could be convinced to join Igalia from someplace else. But that's usually not a big set of people. So a lot of times we need to hire somebody, but there might not be somebody with the necessary skills, or they might be working on something very different and need to be sort of inducted into this project. So this and a few more questions like this are handled by the coding experience program. The coding experience program exists basically to train people to work in the subject areas that we're interested in. So this usually um, ends up being a hard mentorship program that is involved in a particular area that is pertaining to one of the teams. So let's say that with my team, the compilers team, you join particularly the area of WebAssembly standardization. So you would be mentored by somebody who is actively working on WebAssembly standardization. But at the end of the day, you'll get to choose your project. So that's uh, with the with one particular sort of limitation, that you cannot pick something that we're paid to work on. So something that is outside of Igalia's sort of project scope. So we can mentor you without sort of any bias, or any sort of um another big reason why it is the way it is, and it's not an internship or something else, is that the way it is in our industry, internships are very exploitative. In most organizations, like traditional organizations that I've heard about, internships can be quite daunting. Sometimes it's not something relevant, and people come out of internships feeling like they haven't learned anything, or in many cases they can come out of an internship feeling that they've been wrong, that they have been overworked, or that uh, that they were plain exploited by the company, sort of charging something from the client and paying them less. So because of all of these reasons, the coding experience program is specifically the way it is. It focuses on things that we are not on a deadline for. It focuses on things that we can essentially allow you to wrap your hands around and head around without any pressure or any sort of um, awful situation running into us at some point. So yes, it's different from a traditional internship. It allows you to set your own pace. It assigns you a mentor, and you get to pick whatever you want to work on. It has therefore more in common with GSOC than most internships. But do keep in mind that it has some important features that are from an internship that actually, I think, make it more useful than Google Summer of Code. For example, uh, people who mentor you are Igalians working on projects that are related to what you're doing. So unlike certain open source programs, uh, it might be harder to sort of get a slot, because everybody's time's limited. But when you do end up getting mentored, you usually have a really good mentor who has a very strong sort of grasp of everything that you're working on. So that can be quite profound. And yeah, apart from that, the C program runs for either 3 months full time or 6 months part time, and so on. So people can sort of be a part of the program while uh, keeping up with their schedules.
Cool, thanks. Sounds like a pretty nice program. I Now I have another question for you, which is, I think you are aware of how most engineering colleges environment is like in India. So I wanted to ask, what kind of changes would you think, like what kind of environment would you want, which could promote this sort of inquisitiveness and stuff?
Yeah, this is a very dangerous question for me. Also,
Yep.
with the time, I mean, I would love to talk
Yeah.
about this for 7 hours, but no, to say the
In brief,
least.
I think. Yes.
No, okay. Well, to say the least, and
Mm.
I'm sorry that I have to say this. I'm really, really upset with the way classrooms are back home, and we are not working hard enough. I do think that clubs like ours, like OSDC, and respective clubs in different universities fill the gap, and that's beautiful. That's amazing, and it's really
Yep.
stellar. The students can come together, and I think that's important, right? Like students need to come together and do all of these things. I'm not saying that the administration needs to get involved in any way. They don't, but I think what you think about when you enter a university, what you're told about by the administration, that you need to study in a certain way, that most people end up learning is the more inefficient way, and essentially you need something more collaborative, something more interactive to replace that, something more creative to replace that. So I think the kind of culture that we have created in the various open source clubs is a way more ideal structure. Would universities adopt these structures? I'm not quite sure, because universities are complex organizations. They are not they do not just give you an education, they also give you credentials, and they care a lot about their internal hierarchy and all these things. So I'm not sure if these can be adopted, but if they can be, I think everybody would have a nicer time figuring out what they want to work on then, and what they want to learn, rather than being forced to learn something.
Yep. Absolutely agreed. I think we have a question from the YouTube chat, and I think it's a more general question, and I like it. I think it was about, uh, what do you think about a programmer who is into specializing stuff, who is just going one after another, single mind, and someone who is looking into getting a bit of everything, kind of generalizing. I think,
Yeah,
yeah.
personally, I would
Though,
say, yeah. Sorry, go on.
yeah, I was just going to say that I think this will have to be kind of brief.
Yeah,
We'll
yeah.
be wrapping it up after this last question. Yes.
Yeah, I think I've personally flip flopped on this quite a bit. I've always, for a very long time, tried to be a strong generalist. Right now, based on what you must have heard about my credentials, that is not the case. I'm starting to feel at this point that it's a wrong, like it's a bad dichotomy. Jack of all trades, master of none is not quite how things work, and in many cases, the people who are most successful, or the ones that I know are sort of the most informed, the most interesting programmers that I know, are actually a jack of all trades, master of some, or many, in many cases. So what I'm saying is that essentially, at the end of the day, when it comes to making money, when it comes
Um,
to making like big projects, and like being part of a very responsible part of a big project, you benefit a lot from over specializing, and therefore a lot of people end up over specializing. Whenever you're part of a team, you might have to fill a role. Not everybody can work in extremely chaotic teams, and not all extremely chaotic teams actually work well. But at the same time, you still, like, being in this specialized position doesn't mean that you get to not have generalized understanding of the rest of the space. Just because you're a web developer doesn't mean that you can ignore, for example, fundamental building blocks about something such as operating system. Like, what I'm saying is that you need a sort of generalized base on which to build your specialized personality, because otherwise you're just ignorant. Like, not ignorant in the sense that you don't know what you need to know, but you're just less informed than your peers on more subjects. So in order to build good software, you need to have a bit of both, I feel. But anyway, that's it. I'm not sure if Akshat is speaking. No.
Akshat, are you there? We can't hear you. Uh, Maybe, yeah, I think just. Okay, I think Akshat is here.
Sorry for the last minute fiasco.
No worries.
I think, yeah, yep, that was pretty much it. Thanks for that thing about generalizing. Uh, Again, I think this would be the end of the session, and like I really liked the thing about having a presence of open source and having students be the be the environment in which they can grow by themselves. Uh, be like the takeaway for me at least, and which is why again FOSS Clubs for the win. And again, thank you so much for taking your time out coming here. Also, thank you everyone at home watching this event. We would be having a forum thread on the FOSS United's forum where you can ask more questions and people from the community would try their best to answer them. And I think everyone should now go on to have a lovely evening. Yes.
Thanks.
Bye bye. Yep, except
Yeah.
Ujjwal, for whom it would be an afternoon.